Before a single wall went up, someone had to make the fastener that would hold it together. That meant heating iron, hammering a rod, tapering four sides, and pinching ahead, one nail at a time. A skilled nailer working fast could produce a few hundred nails in a long day. A framed house needed thousands. You can do the math, and it isn't pretty. For most of recorded history, nails were not the throwaway hardware you find in a paper box at the back of a hardware store. They were counted, stored carefully, and sometimes listed in household inventories alongside tools and livestock. In colonial Virginia, records show families burning down old structures specifically to sift nails from the ash. That detail says everything about how these objects were valued at the time. The nail itself is ancient. Romans used iron nails, and so did Egyptian builders working in wood. But ancient nails were not standardized in any meaningful sense. Each one was shaped by whoever made it, in whatever size that smith felt appropriate. You couldn't assume two nails from different smiths would behave the same way under a hammer. That inconsistency wasn't a minor inconvenience. It affected how carpenters planned their work. The hand-forged nail, called a wrought nail, started as a square iron rod heated in a forge until it was workable. The nailer would taper 3 or 4 sides with a hammer, cut the shaft, then reinsert the blunt end and strike the head into shape. Every step required judgment, heat management, and physical repetition. The work was real and the pace was slow, but the resulting nail had something modern wire nails lack. Wrought iron contains thin threads of slag running along the grain of the metal. When you drove a wrought nail into wood, those slag threads helped grip the fibers. It held with a kind of mechanical stubbornness. Pull tests on old timber frames occasionally find wrought nails that haven't moved in 200 years. That grip came partly from the material, partly from the slight irregularity of the shape. A perfectly uniform nail doesn't always grip a plank the way a slightly uneven one does. Which is an odd thing to say in favor of inconsistency, but the physics didn't care about the principle. The labor cost shaped how buildings were designed in ways that aren't obvious at first. Timber framing, the method of using heavy posts and beams joined with wooden joinery, used relatively few nails. Mortise and tenon joints, wooden pegs, and notched connections did most of the structural work. This wasn't purely a choice about elegance or craft. It was partly a practical response to the cost of iron fasteners. You used joinery where you could, and you saved your nails for where you couldn't. The smaller and more rural the community, the more carefully those nails were managed. Some colonial American households had a dedicated nail rod, a length of iron kept specifically to be worked into nails when needed. Children and teenagers were often the ones doing the nailing in the evening or off-season, turning rod into fasteners by the light of a forge fire. Thomas Jefferson ran a small nail-making operation at Monticello, using enslaved boys between the ages of 10 and 16. He tracked their output carefully and considered it one of the more reliable income streams on the property. That context matters. The nail economy in early America was embedded in systems of coerced labor in ways the cheerful hardware store history tends to omit. The first mechanical improvement arrived not in the factory but in a fairly simple machine that could cut nails from flat sheet iron. Cut nails, as they came to be called, appeared in the late 1700s and spread through the early 1800s. The machine took a rolled iron plate and sheared off tapered blanks, flat on 2 sides rather than 4. A separate process added the head, either by machine or still by hand depending on the operation. Cut nails were faster to produce and cheaper to buy, and that combination started to shift what builders could afford to do. The price of nails began to fall in a way that, over decades, quietly changed the logic of construction. When nails get cheap enough, wooden joinery starts to look expensive, not in materials but in the skilled labor it requires. A mortise and tenon joint demands a trained carpenter with chisels and time. A nailed connection demands a hammer, some nails, and considerably less of both. That trade-off would eventually reshape how houses were built across an entire continent. But cut nails had their own limitations, and it took a few decades for those to become obvious. The flat cross-section that made them easy to produce also made them prone to splitting certain wood species along the grain. Drive a cut nail into a dry pine plank the wrong way, and the wood would crack ahead of the tip. Experienced carpenters learned to orient the flat face of a cut nail so it compressed the wood grain rather than splitting it. That's not something you read in a manual, it was knowledge passed between workers on sites. The machinery to produce cut nails also required flat rolled iron of consistent thickness, which meant the nail supply was tied to the iron rolling industry. When rolling mills improved, cut nail quality improved with them, and when mills had problems, the nail supply felt it. Supply chains for building materials were already more interconnected than they looked from the outside. By the mid-1800s, cut nails dominated the American market, and were being exported in quantity. Nail production had shifted from individual smiths and household forges to mills and factories. The nail ceased to be a handmade object and became a product, something manufactured at volume and bought by the pound. That shift in identity from crafted item to commodity matters because it changed how builders thought about waste. When nails cost real labor to produce, you straightened bent ones, you pulled them carefully, you did not leave them on the ground. When nails cost a few cents per pound, a bent nail got tossed, a missed swing was shrugged off, and offcuts were left where they fell. The relationship between a builder and a fastener changed because the fastener stopped feeling scarce. Wire nails arrived in the United States in the 1880s, and the industry did not welcome them quietly. Cut nail manufacturers argued that wire nails were weak, that they lacked holding power, that they would split wood unpredictably. Some of that was genuine concern. Some of it was a business with capital equipment facing an uncomfortable new competitor. Wire nails were drawn from steel wire, pulled through a die to a precise diameter, then cut and headed by machine. The process was faster than cut nail production by a significant margin, and steel was becoming cheaper as Bessemer furnace technology spread. A wire nail was round in cross-section, which meant it pushed wood fibers aside rather than shearing through them the way a cut nail did. In dry hardwoods, that could mean more splitting risk without a pilot hole. The critics weren't entirely wrong. But in the dimensional softwood lumber that was flooding the market from Pacific Northwest mills, wire nails performed well enough. And well enough at a lower price tends to win most industrial arguments eventually. By 1900, wire nail production had surpassed cut nails in the United States, and the transition was essentially complete within another decade. The cut nail didn't disappear. It's still made today, still used in hardwood flooring and masonry applications where its holding characteristics matter. But it went from being the default fastener to being the specialist one, which is a significant demotion. The wire nail's victory was partly about the nail itself and partly about what was happening around it. Balloon framing, a construction method using long continuous vertical studs nailed together rather than jointed, had been developing since the 1830s. It required enormous numbers of nails and relatively less skilled carpentry labor than traditional timber framing. Critics at the time called it balloon framing as a mild insult, implying it was flimsy and insubstantial. The name stuck even as the method proved structurally adequate for the wood-framed houses that were spreading across American cities and plains towns. Cheap wire nails and balloon framing reinforced each other in a way that neither could have achieved alone. The nail made the framing method economically viable at scale, and the framing method created sustained demand for cheap nails by the keg. Chicago rebuilt itself after the 1871 fire, largely using balloon-framed structures assembled with cut and early wire nails. The speed of that reconstruction would not have been possible with timber-framed joinery requiring skilled craftsmen at every connection. That's not a minor footnote. The ability to rebuild a major city quickly depended partly on a fastener being cheap and a framing method being simple enough to teach fast. Standardization followed production in ways that weren't always planned in advance. Nail sizes got codified into the penny system, a confusing unit that persists today largely because the industry grew around it before anyone thought to replace it. A 16D nail, called a 16 penny nail, is 3.5 inches long. Why 16 penny? Because 100 of them once cost 16 pennies. Or something close to that, depending on which historical account you trust. The actual origin of the penny system is genuinely disputed among historians of hardware. Whatever the origin, the sizing stuck, first in habit, then in building codes, then in the language carpenters use without thinking about it. A framing carpenter today still calls out 16 penny sinkers, the way mechanics call out socket sizes. The unit is embedded in the trade's vocabulary. That kind of linguistic lock-in matters because it ties the object to a system larger than itself. Nail guns change the physical experience of nailing without changing the fundamental object being driven. A pneumatic framing nailer still loads wire nails, collated in plastic or paper strips, but wire nails nonetheless. The speed difference between a hammer and a nail gun is roughly what the difference between a hand nailer and a cut nail machine was in 1810. Each step made the fastener disappear faster into the structure, which is perhaps the clearest sign that something has become infrastructure. You stop noticing the thing that makes everything else hold together. Modern construction lumber and modern wire nails are calibrated around each other in ways that would make substitution difficult even if someone wanted to change the standard. Nail length recommendations in building codes are written for the dimensional lumber sizes and wood species commonly available. Change the nail, change the lumber, or change the species mix, and the code tables stop applying cleanly. That interdependence is exactly why the basic wire nail, round shank, flathead, steel has remained stable in form for well over a century. There have been refinements, galvanized coatings for outdoor use, ring shank nails for extra withdrawal resistance, hardened nails for masonry, but the core geometry of the common wire nail has not changed in any meaningful way since the 1880s. It's the right size and shape for the system it supports, and the system has no particular reason to change. There's a version of this story that ends with wonder, a small piece of bent steel holding civilization together, and so on. That framing would be doing too much work for what is, at base, a practical object that solved a cost problem at the right historical moment. The more accurate version is that the nail became invisible, precisely because it became cheap and reliable enough to stop being interesting. As with most details in manufacturing and construction history, sources vary on specific dates, prices, and the exact sequence of regional adoption. What's harder to dispute is the general shape of the shift, from scarce handmade fastener to mass commodity, and from commodity to infrastructure so embedded it stopped having a history worth telling. Except that it does.